Another screencast, and this time I'll be discussing the meninges. These are the protective membranes around the brain and the spinal cord. So by the end of this, you should be able to describe the three meningeal layers and their functions, and then also the structure and the function of the blood-brain barrier. So as indicated before, the meninges are specialized membranes that surround and protect the brain and the spinal cord. So here we see a section through the brain, or the skull anyway. And so here is the scalp, right, and the skin here and the hair. The periosteum is a protective connective tissue layer around the outside of the bone, and then here's the bone of the skull. So these are not yet the meninges. We'd have to cut through all these, so the meninges are deep to these. So the meninges here, the three of them are, number one, the Dura Mater, number two, the Arachnoid Mater, and then number three, the Pia Mater, right? And the Dura Mater is a very tough, literally dura, membrane, and it is composed of actually two submembranes there, the periosteal one, which is the outer layer, and then the meningeal one, which is the inner layer. The periosteal one, of course, is attached very tightly to the bone right here, right? The underside of the bone of the skull or of the spinal cord of the spinal column. So then that Dura Mater is very tough. We have some in the room for you to handle, and you can just see exactly how tough that is. Deep to the Dura Mater then is the Arachnoid Mater, so named because it looks like spiderwebby stuff. There are layers of connective tissue, collagen fibers that are hanging down from that. That Arachnoid Mater is attached to this meningeal part of the Dura Mater rather tightly. So then that Arachnoid Mater, there is a little space there between the Arachnoid Mater and then the Pia Mater. The Pia Mater is a delicate, or Pia, membrane that is attached directly under the surface of the brain or the spinal cord. In this case, the brain, and you see it right here attached to the, attached to the gray matter. That Pia Mater often remains in touch with the brain. So the sheep brains that we have in class, you can see the Pia Mater on there, and if you try to peel it off, it sort of disintegrates as you peel it off. Pardon me. So then that little space between the Arachnoid Mater and the Pia Mater is the subarachnoid space. So this subarachnoid space contains blood vessels, and so arteries and veins. But notice that these blood vessels are not in direct contact with any of the gray matter or the white matter. That Pia Mater is a physical anatomical barrier between the blood there. But suffice it to say that gases will be able to diffuse into them and out of them. Some nutrients are able to cross there as well. One final, if we look on the left side over here, we have this subdural space, and this is descriptive of where it is between the Dura Mater, and here's the outer layer of the Dura Mater, here's the inner layer of the Dura Mater, right? And the Arachnoid Mater, and then we have this subarachnoid space here, again, that I was mentioning, that is full of blood vessels. So these spaces, as well as this sinus, right? So this sinus and this space are all going to be filled with CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid, and more on the exact contents of the cerebrospinal fluid later. But suffice it to say that the cerebrospinal fluid is essentially bathing all of the connective tissue and bathing all of that nervous tissue, and the brain and the spinal cord are essentially floating in that cerebrospinal fluid. That cerebrospinal fluid is being circulated all throughout these sinuses and these spaces as well. Look for another screencast describing the movement of that. All right. So let's get another view here of these membranes. And again, so location and structure of the cranial meninges. So again, these are the ones around the brain. And so we've taken a section out of the brain here. We have this mid-sagittal section here, and we are looking at the thickness of the skull. So again, here's the skull. So this is the outer Dura Mater there. That would be the periosteal layer. This is a sinus, this dural or venous sinus, and again, this is the space between the two layers of the Dura Mater, and then this would be cerebrospinal fluid in there. So this is the outer Dura Mater layer, this is the inner Dura Mater layer. Here we have our subdural space between the Dura Mater, the meningeal Dura Mater, and then the Pia Mater, or the Arachnoid Mater, pardon me, the Arachnoid Mater here. So then these are all the connective tissue fibers hanging down from that Arachnoid Mater. There would be CSF in here as well. And then finally we have the Pia Mater right here, directly in contact with the cerebral cortex, again, gray matter and white matter in places. So we have these layers, these meningeal layers become continuous with the spinal cord and then continue down on the spinal cord. So here's the spinal cord. This is a transverse section now through the cord. This is the posterior. This would be anterior, right? And then these are the lateral sides of the vertebrae there. And we are able to see those layers continued again. So there's this epidural space here between the bone, the vertebra, and the Dura Mater. So it's a little bit different than you have up here in the skull. We have this epidural space. Epi is upon, right? And that is filled with this adipose tissue. And again, this is also very well vascularized adipose tissue. Right? Then deep to the epidural space, you're going to have the Dura Mater. Here's the Dura Mater. There's only one layer of that down here. Here's the subdural space, then the arachnoid, then the subarachnoid space here, and then finally the Pia Mater. The delicate Pia Mater is going to be on the spinal cord itself, and that goes all the way around the cord. Another view of this, anterolateral view, and of course these are all cartoon images here. Again, you should be able to, not look at any of these label lines here and sort of be able to place here the meninges as well as some of the other anatomical features of the cord if you've looked at the other screencast so far. Right? So just more images there to practice with. This is an actual image of the Dura Mater, so it's a posterior view of the skull here, and we're able to see that this Dura Mater is very opaque. It's whitish, off-whitish in color, and is very tough. And again, I encourage you to look at that in class and handle that, the sample that we have there. And one other thing I want to point out is that where the brain and the spinal cord meet is right here, and there's a large hole in the bottom of the skull called the foramen. Foramen is a hole. Magnum. And that foramen magnum is where the Dura Mater, the Arachnoid Mater, and the Pia Mater of the brain become continuous with the meninges of the spinal cord. And a condition associated with this is a pathology of Spina Bifida. And Spina Bifida, if we look at the image down here, if we look at the cartoon image here, we see that there's this rather large swelling, right? And it is full of this cerebrospinal fluid here. Right? And so we have the normal spine here to compare it with. Right? And so what happens in Spina Bifida is, now we can look down here, the spinous process of the vertebra, here's the body of the vertebra, the spinous process of the vertebra have not formed here. And so normally you'd have bone surrounding this, but in the case of Spina Bifida, you do not have the bone there. And so not having that bone present, it allows a posterior protrusion here for the meninges. The meninges are still intact. Right here we see the Dura Mater, and then this enlarged fluid-filled space would be with that cerebrospinal fluid there. And there's no posterior physical bony protection for the delicate spinal cord down here. Sometimes, and this of course exists on a range of severity. Sometimes this can be surgically repaired, other times not so much. So one pathology associated with this. The more I don't have an image of this, but the more common pathology you probably hear of the meninges is meningitis. And so this itis ending is an inflammation, and that inflammation of the meninges would be due to something like a bacterial infection, something like a viral infection. You could even have fungal spores in there, although this is extremely less common. But you get these bacterial or viral infections in there. And of course, this inflammation or this swelling, you could imagine, since there is bone typically in the way, that there's nowhere for that pressure to be relieved. And so the very delicate tissue of the brain and the spinal cord potentially are damaged there. And so a way to alleviate some of that meningitis, or a way to actually diagnose it, whether it's bacterial or viral, is to do what is known as an LP, or a lumbar puncture. And so a lumbar puncture would be in the lumbar area. You take a needle and you penetrate the Dura Mater, and you penetrate the epidural space, you penetrate the Dura Mater, and you then remove some of that CSF, and you test it to diagnose whether or not you are bacterial or viral. This lumbar puncture, or LP, is also sometimes referred to as a spinal tap. And you do it down here at around L2, L3, right where the cord is ending. Okay, so just a little pathology there. And finally, the blood-brain barrier. So you have these physical membranes, meninges, protecting the brain, but then you also have cells like the astrocytes here that are physically wrapping around the blood vessels, and you have their extensions right here. So they form a physical barrier as well as a chemical barrier for any bacteria, viruses to penetrate that delicate CSF and cause something like meningitis. Although it does happen sometimes. Sometimes these junctions between the astrocytes here are not as tight, and you get some leakage there. But they are small enough for gases to pass across, and some other nutrients as well. Should something get into that CSF, you have the microglial cells, which are acting like immune system cells, which are acting like white blood cells, to be able to engulf those bacteria, those viruses, fungal spores that may happen to actually penetrate. So just because they get in there into the CSF does not mean that they are going to stay there and cause any sort of damage. Right, so coloring book pages there to take a look at as well. And so you should be able to identify, describe here the 3 meningeal layers and their basic functions, as well as that structure and function of the blood-brain barrier. Thanks for listening, and bring your questions to class.